Welcome to Softlogic Stockbrokers Market Thoughts, your go-to program for timely analysis and expert insights on Sri Lanka's macroeconomy, stock market trends, and political developments. So nowadays, the biggest talk of the town is Israel-Iran conflict. So let's ask Renal about his opinion on this. So Renal, how have global oil prices reacted to this recent Israel-Iran conflict?
Yes, Ravani. So actually, I think we see a very significant reaction immediately coming through when it comes to especially crude oil. I think after the first few days of the war really breaking out, you've seen crude oil going up by almost 10% in global markets. So this is definitely going to have a ripple effect on multiple economies. And if you actually look at what some foreign investment banks and different analysts are forecasting, there are lots of forecasts for crude oil to be somewhere within the range of about 100 to 120. So this is definitely something to keep an eye out for. But what we also need to be aware of is that this is an ongoing situation. I think just as we were beginning this program, I think we got an update that there is talks of the Iranian foreign minister trying to approach the EU to reach some kind of a negotiation. So this is very much an evolving topic as we go through it. But I think it's definitely something we should keep an eye on because there is this impact we're seeing in global markets.
So what are the potential impact on Sri Lanka's market with these rising oil prices?
So essentially what we see in Sri Lanka is that I think one of our leading economists put it quite well, which is if there is going to be a 10%, 15%, 20% increase in prices, you're immediately looking at an additional amount of reserves that would be required for that purpose. So that is something to factor in. But leaving aside the international markets, if you just consider where we are domestically, both petrol and diesel have been significantly more expensive than what it is today. And so therefore, even if there is going to be, let's say, a 10-15% increase in some of these prices, it might not necessarily go to levels where the market has never necessarily seen before this. Is it going to be easy? No. It's also going to have some kind of an inflationary impact, which also needs to be factored in. But even when we are looking at something like that, what's interesting to note is Sri Lanka has been on a deflationary path. So even if there is a bit of inflationary pressure that comes in through some of these crude oil prices, other things being held constant, I think that is something we might be able to sum up because we are not on the highest band right now of where our inflation target should be. So yes, there is definitely going to be an impact to some extent in Sri Lanka. And I think subsequent to the price changes happening, that would also be reflected. If you actually look at it, I think the Sri Lankan government had given a statistic something to the extent of 2 to 2.5 months of fuel reserves are currently available. So if that is the case, again, if this is going to be more of a short-term thing, we might be able to wear it out. But if it is going to continue over a medium to long term, then that is definitely something to be aware of.
So apart from that, how does the conflict affect this global fertilizer market, mainly nitrogen and potassium exports from these Israel and Iran markets?
Yeah. So actually what's very interesting is there is a significant amount of urea that is being exported from the Middle East. And again, this is something that needs to be considered because if you look at the Russia-Ukraine war, that too is a conflict that is surrounding a couple of countries that were large fertilizer or urea exporters. So the world was already in a system where, or rather in a situation where the fertilizer prices globally had seen a major fluctuation. Now, from that side of the world, things did slightly settle down, not in terms of the conflict, but more in terms of prices. But when you look at specifically Iran, I know it's been now a few days, but there initially was also a fire that was reported in one of its major natural gas reserves. That is something to watch out for because natural gas is one of the key indicators of also what fertilizer prices would be. Because natural gases are required in the process to extract nitrogen from the air And what we've seen is, because nitrogen is a key component of fertilizer, that there is a very, very high correlation between natural gas prices and fertilizer in the past. So if natural gas is to go up, then yes, there could be an impact in terms of fertilizer as well. I think to double check this theory, we also spoke to a couple of the largest fertilizer importers in Sri Lanka. And what they also mentioned was that yes, an impact like this is quite possible. In fact, speaking to CIC specifically, they mentioned that they have about 1 month in terms of inventories currently. But beyond that point, they would naturally be susceptible to whatever the global price changes are. And that is also something to keep an eye out for. Now, we spoke about crude oil and how that could also impact potential global inflation and Sri Lankan inflation. So when it comes to fertilizer as well, it's also another contributor to food inflation, although the impact comes in a slightly staggered basis through the farmers and through food prices over time.
So one thing Sri Lankans might be wondering about is that there are many Sri Lankans employed in the Middle East. So how might this impact our remittances going forward?
Yes, so I think when it comes to remittances, we also need to look at it from a short-term perspective and a long-term perspective. Now, if you specifically look at Israel and Iran, I would say there's a very limited number of people. If memory serves me well, it was less than about 1% of people who had left for foreign employment last year who actually went to Israel. And again, if I remember right, it was about just 2 or 3 people who actually went to Iran from this entire lot. So Iran particularly and Israel might not be the biggest concern. It's actually the neighboring regions. And for them to be severely impacted, I think then the conflict has to escalate to a much larger level. So far, I think it hasn't gone there yet. But I think that is, if at all, something we need to keep an eye out on. But when we look at our foreign employment statistics specifically, there is something very interesting to note, because Sri Lanka does not have a very high amount of skilled workers or other professionals who are being employed in these countries. So essentially, when you see a lot of Sri Lankans wanting to go to the Middle East, essentially they go to an agency that links them up with a job somewhere in a country in the Middle East. So it's not necessarily a selected or hand-picked country that people are going to. Because of that, even if there is going to be, let's say, a conflict in a particular country, there is a good possibility that people will go to the next available country in order to work and to earn some money to send back to Sri Lanka. So this is something that we've seen, not due to a crisis, but even naturally expanding beyond just the Middle East. I think recently we have been in discussions with a population of Sri Lankans working in Korea, which is probably something relatively new to our markets, and we've seen them be so interested in investing in the stock exchange as well. So these are the kind of changes that we're seeing. So even if, let's say, on the medium to long term, if another country is to be potentially impacted by this, what I believe is you would essentially see that labor force moving from one location to another, and not necessarily that labor force entirely returning back to Sri Lanka. So that is a key thing that I see, because if you look at our total migration, I think it was less than about 10% who are actual professionals who left. And it was, I think, less than 5% before COVID and the crisis. So there's only a very small number of people, and those people would opt for countries like Australia, Canada, UK, US, those kinds of countries. So what we're seeing now is a slightly different landscape. And for people working in the Middle East, I think they would go to the quickest possible alternative if something were to happen in the country they were working.
And also, what could be the potential impact on our tourism industry going forward with these conflicts escalating?
Yes. So I think it's very interesting, because you need to analyze Sri Lanka's tourism situation and the global tourism impact slightly differently. I think as you two have been having a look at, I think when you look at tourism, Sri Lanka is seeing some phenomenal numbers. If you look at it, a couple of months ago, we hit 1 million tourists, and I think at the moment we're comparing it to 2018, which is the best year for Sri Lanka's tourism, and we're still ahead, right? And if you look at, let's say, the first 2 weeks of this month as well, we've seen an extraordinary number of tourists coming in. I think we've seen over 63,000 tourists coming in for the first 2 weeks, whereas in 2018, the previous peak, we saw only 113,000 people, if I remember right, coming in, which means we're on track to beat that even with the last 2 weeks arrivals. So Sri Lanka in particular has been making this very significant recovery, and I think that recovery itself might outpace the general sentiment for tourism. Because when you're looking at it from a global perspective, yes, we are going to see an increase in flight prices, which is going to make things quite challenging. And also you would see probably a little bit of uncertainty for people who are flying either in or through the region. Because flights over the conflict area, yes, they have avoided it. But even coming through the region, people might be a little concerned. So there might be a potential impact coming from that side. But I think that is very dependent on also how long this conflict continues. And if it turns out to be something that goes on for months without end, then there could be something serious to consider. But as of now, if this is resolved in a shorter period of time, I think the Sri Lankan tourism story is actually quite interesting, quite good.
And also, could disruptions in shipping routes or regional trade flows affect Sri Lanka's tea exports, especially to these Iran and other West Asian markets?
Yes, it could. But actually, just to touch on a small point I missed earlier, when we were talking on tourism, another key thing to understand is this May-June period is also the off-peak season for Sri Lanka, right? So, being a little lower during this period is not necessarily also our greatest concern, because we can easily make this up by the end of the year. November, December, January, if arrivals turn out to be quite good, I think that is something Sri Lanka would be more than happy with. So I think that is also then something to consider. And sorry, I'll come back to your question, which is in terms of tea. So in terms of tea, I think one of the biggest concerns that people have, or rather one of the first things that comes to mind, is this whole conversation regarding the tea for oil barter when you're looking at Iran. But again, to the best of my knowledge, this particular thing was more in terms of repaying a certain amount of debt, right? So once that is settled, I think this is not going to be a major issue. And if you also look at how much of tea we're actually exporting to Iran, Iran accounts for less than 4% of our total tea exports. So it's not necessarily that Iran is going to be a huge chunk from our exports. In fact, it's Iraq, if I could be specific, that is actually the bigger player, which is almost 3 times of what Iran is taking. Now that's also a key player to watch out for, because they're kind of caught in the middle of this. So that is something to be aware of as to what that impact could be. And overall, in the Middle East or globally, if you are also going to see potentially a higher amount of inflation, you're also potentially going to see a higher shipping cost. Because if you look at vessels that are going through the area, there is now a much higher insurance cost they need to bear. So shipping costs have gone up quite significantly. So there is going to be some kind of an impact that might come over this upcoming period, which again significantly depends on how long this conflict goes on for, and how different vessels and whatnot also could be impacted by it. So those are all things we need to consider when we are looking at our tea markets. But I think for the time being, things don't seem to have a major impact, but it is something that needs to be followed very closely.
So what are the other export sectors in Sri Lanka that might get affected because of this conflict?
Yes, so I think as I was kind of touching on shipping, right? Because most of our exports do go that route, an increase in shipping costs is going to be something that almost all export companies around the world need to be concerned about. If you're also going to see potentially an increase in the crude oil as we're already seeing, and that potentially driving an increase in terms of global inflation. If you're going to see economic activity levels also being slightly constrained, then I think more from a demand side also there is going to be a bit of a concern. And also when you're looking at, I think more broadly, manufacturing facilities. Anybody who is very fuel intensive at this point is going to also have a slight increase in terms of the prices prices for production.
And also, how might increased global energy and commodity prices affect inflation and cost of living in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, so I think, we talked a bit about how it would be globally, but to break it down more specifically to Sri Lanka, if you look at the last 12 months, our inflation is actually negative. We've seen actually a deflationary trend in the market. And what that means is if you also look at what the central bank is trying to do, or if you look at where we're trying to go, we're actually trying to bring inflation up. We're trying to bring inflation up to our target levels. So even the last rate cut that you saw, or a couple of the rate cuts before also, have cited this as a key reason why they are doing what they're doing. So Sri Lanka is in a slightly different situation, I would say, to most other markets, because we are in a deflationary state and a bit of pressure coming back towards inflation is not going to be the greatest concern. If we were more in a situation where our inflation is kind of at the highest band of where we want it to be, then yes, we have the potential of breaking through that band and seeing a higher level of inflation. But because we are well below the band and because we're actually in a deflationary situation as of right now, I think there is still a bit more breathing space that we would have. And I think the central bank has also done a good job of regulating this. Because if you remember right, just a few years ago, we had inflation at 60-70%. So from that point, we've significantly been able to tame inflation. And even now, we have a bit of breathing space if inflation was to go up a bit. And if it's going beyond a certain level, I think I am quite confident that the central bank will do what's required to keep it within a target range.
So Renal, thank you. And that marks the end of our discussion. So for more updates, subscribe our YouTube channel, Softlogic Stockbrokers.